Alrighty, welcome back everybody. So today we are going to be talking about, again, therapy and Catholicism. So tonight we're going to be going into the ideas of the 12-step movement because we've already talked about how we can use the parts or the faculties of our active mind, of our abilities of our conscious mind to control our passions. And we've talked about how we can use the redeemed versions of the mindfulness therapies, redeemed versions of visualization, redeemed versions of cognitive therapies, and redeemed versions of behavioral therapies. And so in this video, and it isn't me scratching my nose, we are going to talk about and see the ways of dealing with the 12-step movement. So, the basic thing that we're going to look at is that the 12-step movement is something that's often conceived of as a religious therapy. It's often conceived of as Christian. It's often conceived of in this way. The actual truth is much more complicated because in actuality there are elements and ways in which the actual steps of the 12-step movement are somewhat different than what we might call Christianity. There is a sense of a difference of level and a sense of a failure of content. So, for example, we see in the 12 steps the emphasis on recovery rather than redemption, so a difference of level. There's also a sense in which we have a failure of content or a restriction of content. So, for example, in Christianity, we trust in Jesus Christ. In the 12-step movement, we trust in a higher power of anybody's choosing. And in Christianity, we have, or Catholicism, we specifically have objective moral standards, that we know what to do and what not to do. We have guidelines to evaluate ourselves. In the 12-step movement, we may be invited to take a moral inventory, but there are no specified standards of morality. So what happens is that we have this kind of thing that's recovery, not religion, higher power, not Christ, and morality, moral evaluation, but no moral standards. So there are some issues here. So in this type of an approach, which is often attacked as Christian, it's often attacked by outside people as Christian, it should not rightly be understood as entirely a Christian approach. The actual development of the 12-step movement is kind of a hodgepodge where you see, if you look at the things that the founder Bill Wilson did, and this is public knowledge, so I'm not saying some type of detraction that's unnecessary, you will see things that are really blended. You will see him engaging, for example, with a Catholic priest, who was linking some of the steps to the Ignatian spiritual exercises. You'll see him also engaging in things like trying to do spiritism, being mediumship. So you will see the occult, where he's kind of going off into the occult. You'll see ways in which he's interested in Catholicism, very much so. You will see things like that. So there's these differences. And so sometimes you'll also see in the early literature of Alcoholics Anonymous, you will see that some people have proposed this difference between the Akron AA and the New York AA, and how there seems to be more Christianity in the Akron AA formulation and less in the New York formulation, and how the New York formulation is the one we usually have today. And the difference really is that there is this, there's this sense in which, there's this blend where there's the very Christian elements to the AA movement, and there are also other elements. So there's also they've also really liked some early New Thought writers. Some of these were recommended for meditation, and, so there's things like that. So there's a wide mixed bag of what the origins of the 12 steps are, kind of ambiguous. It's kind of semi-ambiguous about whether they're channeled They are also partially derived from the principles of the Oxford movement, not to be um, of the Oxford group, not to be confused with the Oxford movement. Um, in It's not to be confused with things like with St. John Henry Newman, in the Anglican Church. The Oxford group is a group of it's like an evangelical group that did things to try to reform its members morally and spiritually. So it's an ambiguity about is the um, 12 steps channeled in a way of like through like through like a process of getting information from spirits. It's not known whether this is the case. It seems like there's some ways in which it seems like he says that they tumbled out. It seemed like there was some sense of some type of revelation, but who knows whether they are really from a spiritual source, meaning not likely a good spiritual source, or if they are merely from his unconscious mind, or if they are, yeah. So, but it's unlikely that they would be a divine revelation that would merely encourage us to have a higher power, not Jesus, and moral evaluation without um, a morality, or confessing to our sponsor rather than confessing to a priest. Yes, there's some good natural. These are some good natural analogies for Catholic processes. Um, so the thing to remember, though, is that the 12-step movements, regardless of their origin, contain many redeemable concepts. For example, even St. Thomas says, if the devil shows up and tells you to be a monk, obey him because he has proposed a good thing. Of course, you need to then say, okay, well, why is he saying this? And then kind of don't get full of yourself, or maybe that's why he's doing it, but obey him. So there can be a sense in which an evil source or a suspect source can. So if we said, okay, if we knew for certain that yes, it was a channeled document that he got the 12 steps in this way, that it was probably from a spirit. Okay, it could still contain truth that it would be redeemable and usable, especially given the scale of the 12-step movement. 12-step movement provides resources and structures that are necessary and helpful for many, many people in many conditions. Um, and so we want to figure out what is redeemable in this group. And it's very clear that there are elements that are redeemable. I mean, obviously, seeking through prayer and meditation to make conscious contact with God is good. Obviously, we want to meditate in the appropriate way in the Catholic tradition, not in a non-Catholic way or a non-authentically human way. We want to ensure that our higher power is Jesus Christ. We want to ensure that our moral inventory is actually done according to objective morality. And we want to realize that making amends does not actually get rid of our guilt. It is, obviously we should make amends, but we have to also, um, you know, believe in Jesus and, through his sacrifice. In the same way, we don't want to only admit the exact nature of our wrongs to God, to another human being, meaning our sponsor. We don't want to confess only to our sponsor and not to a priest. Of course, a sponsor might be able to give us advice specific to a certain type of addiction that a priest might not have the same experience. There could be a usefulness in explaining to someone else, what we've done and what we're struggling with, but it doesn't mean that we should never replace this as a confession. We shouldn't do that. And so the thing is also to remember that these kind of mixed meanings, there's some controversy over whether people can use these groups. In the early days, it was conceived as a Protestant group, and Catholics were generally not encouraged to attend. But as time went on, it seems like even like the very conservative or very traditionalist Catholic groups, such as the SSPX, they are they are saying, okay, things like, yes, you can use, despite the potential for spiritual error, which you're being exposed to, due to the fact that you are going to fall into mortal sin through being drunk, you may, for example, go to AA, as long as you do so under spiritual guidance and direction. So these are things that somebody should not just willy-nilly go to these things. Probably somebody should probably be meeting with a priest, especially if you're struggling with some of these things. There should probably be some type of ensuring that you don't just go off into believing that, okay, now I have this other support group, I don't need church anymore, or yeah, it's all fine, and this is very important because we don't want to dilute our spirituality or replace supernatural spirituality with natural spirituality. And so the thing that may happen, and what I would say these groups are analogous to, are phenomena like Islam or modern Judaism. So, for example, especially things like Islam would represent a natural reverence for God. Even very traditionalist sources like Bishop Athanasius Schneider say things like that in Islam there is a kind of natural worship of the true God. And so the thing is, we might say, okay, yes, if I'm going to worship the Creator, that is but I'm not worshiping the Creator according to the pattern revealed by the Creator. It doesn't mean I'm not worshiping the Creator. It just means that I'm doing so in a natural way. I'm not doing so in a supernatural way. And it doesn't mean, of course, like on some level, we could say that. I mean, on a practical level, I think we could say that God wants to be worshipped rather than not. But in a real way, it's also not pleasing to God in the sense that it's not the way that God is asking you to do it, and it's not being done through grace, and you might be outside of grace. But of course, you want to always revere God as much as you can. So, but it's not really, um, it's not the real thing. It's not the real thing. It doesn't do the same thing as real worship. Um, so that being said, this is similar. This is a similar thing. So what religion is the 12 steps similar to? It's really similar to things like Islam or maybe modern Judaism. It's not similar really to Christianity. It may have some resemblances, it may have some common principles, but it's more analogous to those faiths in its content. And the thing to remember, so what's wrong with the 12 steps? Okay, so we could probably go through every step and kind of say what's wrong with it and what's right about it. And so it probably would be effective if we actually just pull up the steps, and that'll help us actually go through. Let me type in the 12 steps. Alcoholics Anonymous. Here it comes. All right, so you probably can still see me, so I'm going to read these. So the first step involves admitting powerlessness over alcohol, saying that our lives have become unmanageable. And this is from you can find this at www.aa.org/the12 steps. And so in this type of a step, okay, it might be less. So the admission of powerlessness can be somewhat problematic because that's not exactly true. There could be some problematic stuff there because it could say we're very weak to these things, but maybe not powerless. And essentially, there's also a sense in which the direction of our understanding of what we're powerless over is really not only the substance, but also what the substance is trying to provide. And so I think it's very important to realize that we're not always wanting alcohol. We're really trying to control our emotions or trying to deal with the fact that we are upset with our boss. So we might not only be trying to understand that we're powerless over alcohol. It might be saying, okay, I'm really powerless over what happens at my job or what happens in my life, or I really don't have complete control, rather than I'm completely, utterly powerless. Believing that a power that greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity is good, but we want to understand that sanctity is important in addition to sanity, and that the power is Jesus Christ, and by extension, the sacraments of the Catholic Church. May the decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him is good, but the thing is, we want to turn our will and lives over to the care of God, of the true God, not some other God, because depending, obviously, these things can operate in multiple ways. It can be good for a therapist to guide somebody to I mean, it could be a step forward in a sense to try to trust God if your understanding of God is sufficiently compatible with truth. So if I think that maybe there's a God, there might be a situation in which a therapist would say, okay, yeah, well, ask God for help and ask God to reveal himself to you and these type of things, that's okay. But the thing is, it's dangerous if a therapist is a Catholic and the client has an understanding of God that's sufficiently erroneous, such as, okay, I'm part of God in a weird way, or God is nature, or God is Zeus, or something. That's another type of thing. There may be ways in which it can, I think, in my opinion, by encouraging a client to pray to an obviously erroneous conception of God that seems to have some type of a moral problem. At least I wouldn't do that as a Catholic therapist. So when I try to administer something from the 12 steps, I try to only do that with clients who have an understanding of God where when I'm encouraging them to pray, I'm encouraging them to do something that's moving them forward spiritually as opposed to sideways or backward or downward. So we want the understanding of God, I think, to match reality. The other thing is now, so we're going to move on to step 3, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. This step is good, but the thing is that the moral inventory doesn't count for anything if it's not made according to actual moral principles, objective principles. Because the problem is that you may have somebody, um, doing something that's wrong, but they may not think it's wrong. So how could you could be as searching as fearless as you want, but if you don't have an objective morality, you will end up with a major problem because you're not really evaluating yourself and you're falling into the illusion that you are. Then we have step 5, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. This can be fine to do, but again, it doesn't replace sacramental confession, and if it does, it becomes a problem. And we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. Nothing really terrible there, but of course we need to also try to do things about them. Humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. That's okay. We also want to remove sins, guilt, and these things. So shortcomings is not an adequate or is an incomplete term. Made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. That is good, and it's good to make amends, but we don't want to get rid of our guilt existentially and ultimately through anything other than Jesus Christ's sacrifice on the cross, and by extension, the application of that to us through the sacraments and prayer. We don't want to think that, oh, I punched Jim in the face, I hate Jim, I wish Jim dead. Okay, but I took Jim out for a hamburger. That does not get rid of the mortal sin of wanting to kill Jim, of really wanting to kill Jim. Obviously, not a passing thought that you didn't really consent to. When you really want to do this, okay, you need the forgiveness of God, not just making up for what you did in a human way. So made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. Of course, we have to remember that this is a good principle in general, but we could probably always make amends by praying for the person, because God's outside of time. So there's probably always a way to make amends in some way. Continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. There's nothing really wrong with that. Sought through prayer and meditation to help improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. Now, that can be relatively good. Of course, we want to meditate in a way that's appropriate with Catholic teaching. We don't necessarily need to have conscious contact, meaning that we have to know that God is there. We can do that by faith, and we don't want to be wedded to our feelings and our emotions. We want to be able to be free from that and know that by faith we are getting in touch with God, not necessarily only a conscious sense that we are doing so. And we also want to understand that we don't want to necessarily only connect with God as we understand Him. Again, this is the same principle of, okay, if the person is kind of saying, okay, I think there's a God, okay, well, then maybe it's all right to use the 12 steps. But the person's like, I don't believe in the God of the Bible. I believe in my own type of God. All right, now we're not doing so good, I don't think. So I think it's a dicey thing. That's the way I look at it. A dicey thing to encourage prayer to an purposefully, improperly targeted deity. And so that's good. So and having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we try to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. Of course, the message of Jesus Christ is a little broader. Of course, it's good to carry the message to alcoholics. It's good to have a spiritual awakening. We also want it to be deeper. We want even more. We want a redemption. We want a sanctification. We want this to be the message of the gospel and carry it not only to people who are suffering from the same addictions we have, but to people who have every kind of problem. So there's some different ways that we can think about the 12 steps and some benefits and shortcomings of these things. So we heard some differences about their origins. There were some interesting Catholic figures. Um, there's a priest. His name is, I'm trying to think of his name, Father Ed. I think it's Father Ed Dowling is a very interesting Catholic figure, and Sister Ignatia with an IA, like Ignatius IA. These are some interesting, she's known as the Angel of Alcoholics Anonymous. So there are some interesting Catholic figures in the milieu, so to speak, of the 12-step movement in its early origins, and there are ways it can be used and redeemed. But the steps must be interpreted in light of the Catholic tradition and used in light of it, and we don't want to fall into any errors as a result. The irony of the 12 steps is that they are often attacked as overtly Christian by non-Christians and hated as if they are Christian, when really they are incomplete and not really a Christian thing, at least in their current form. And there's a lot of messiness about moral inventory and all these things in these groups, and you can find a lot of all kind of complexity. Some good resources for Catholics, I think, are the group Calix, or the Chalice in Latin, which is a fellowship of alcoholics in the Catholic Church. And there's also a very interesting group which is Catholic in Recovery, which provides a good set of resources. Um, in general, this is a good group to use. I mean, there's some complexity. I don't even really like reading the 12 steps, in the groups, but there's all different ways. I think they can be usable, and I would prefer modifying the actual language of the steps so that we can see some of these, we can kind of change them up a bit. But again, I think the book, and there's also some books there's a book by Dawn Eden Goldstein about the life of Father Ed Dowling. There's also a book called The Soul of Sponsorship, which is a dialogue between Father Ed and the founder of AA, Bill Wilson. And there's also some books on Sister Ignatia. You can look up some books like that. And then there's Scott Wieman's book, The 12 Steps and the Sacraments. I haven't read that personally. There's also an interesting book. There's a book by an Orthodox priest. I think it's 12 Steps to something. I haven't read that in a while. It's very interesting if you also want to read a book that's critical of the 12 steps. Is the book 12 Steps to Destruction by Martin and Deirdre Bobgan. And you can look at this book, which is interesting because then it'll show you how it's not exactly Christian. Then you also read some critical materials by Dr. Lance Dodds. I personally find Lance Dodds' approach to be rational if you read how he does things, but also I don't think that his critique is entirely helpful because it seems that many people are benefiting from these things, and so I don't know that it's necessarily as bleak as he may make it out to be, and it seems I don't think it's as bleak of a thing that he as he proposes it to be. But again, you have to look at it. So you have to look at the research. You have to look at these things. But Lance Dodds' method is a little bit different than this stuff. So there's some critiques of AA. There's the book 12 Steps to Destruction, and then there's the 12 Steps to the Sacraments. So there's some multiple sides to this issue. There's some Catholics involved. There's some, as I said, Bill Wilson got into some things that were a little bit occult, and you could see these like talking to the dead. So you could see these in a weird way, not praying to the saints. It's like, doing like spiritism. So the thing is, you don't want to get involved with any of that, obviously, but there's none of that. You're not going to see that as a normal part of being encouraged in AA. So the thing really is just watching out also for the errors of indifferentism. So like, okay, it doesn't matter what God you're praying to. So there's some benefits and drawbacks of this approach. And so it's not something that you would say would be simply all good and all Christian. It's something that's a bit more complicated. And that brings us also to making it, the mention of people like Martin and Deirdre Bobkin makes us realize that there's also the field of biblical counseling, which was one time, there's also, um, you know, Martin and Deirdre Bobkin, they actually go further and they switch from a perspective where they actually don't even feel that you should counsel. They feel they have this idea of ministering versus counseling. So they go even further toward the counseling itself as a profession is not redeemable. I don't think that is a helpful understanding, because it's like even the structure of the churches that they are referring to are not necessarily ancient, and their understandings. The thing is, they say many things. I own all the books by the Bobkins, but you have to read it like in this strange way, because the Bobkins will bring up many effective critiques of every type of psychotherapy, and their points should be well heeded and understood. But it's deeply difficult for somebody to really understand the critiques, because there's a slight philosophical error, I believe, in their critique, because they basically make Christianity out to be oppositional to all outside ideologies rather than redemptive of them. And so it's this sense in which, yes, they organize they find very good research, and they say that pretty much there's really bad stuff about everything. But yes, but it's also to understand what is redeemable about everything. And so I think that's the difference. And I don't take this perspective of the ministering versus counseling. I also think that we can look at things like Jay Adams. He's somebody who does biblical counseling. You can look at things like biblical counseling. You can look at Protestant types of faith-based counseling. You can look at those things, and I'm sure there's a lot of redeemable elements. I mean, anything that's from Scripture is redeemable, obviously, because it's already holy. So there's probably a lot of different ways. I personally like the approaches of Dr. Townsend, and there's Dr. Townsend, and then there's another guy who usually writes alongside Townsend. Um, and so they write the books like Boundaries. So these are some different things that are redeemable. Other things that are really important, I forgot to mention about the 12 steps, is really, I think, the idea of codependence is a very interesting construct. It's not perfect, but books by like Pia Melody, especially, like her books, especially her book Facing Love Addiction, I very highly recommend that book. The only thing I would say that's difficult about these things is things like when you start to understand things like relationship patterns, such as those like between codependent and addicted people, such as people who have codependency and like borderline and all these different struggles of symptom sets, like the borderline symptom set and all this. You really have a lot of problems, because you may end up reducing people to labels rather than trying to find these tendencies in an empathetic way in yourself as well, even if they are existing in a smaller form. So it can be dangerous to use these labels like I'm an addict or this and that. I don't think that. So, for example, um, or you're a narcissist. I don't think that's helpful, because we all are that to some degree. So I don't think it's helpful ultimately to use those type of labels in dangerous ways. So the other thing I wanted to say is also like AA. They always say like, "Hi, like I'm Bill, and I'm an addict." I don't think that that's effective. I think something like from groups like Celebrate Recovery, which, there's some some priests might say, don't go to the worship service that may accompany that, but you might be able to go to the group. So it seems like a prudential judgment area, like, because some of these things may be plugged into a Protestant church with Protestant theology. I've been to these meetings, for better or worse, where it is at like a Protestant church, even though they hand out communion. So yeah, it's like this is something that's dicier for people than just going to an AA meeting. But there can be a greater merit to maybe attending the support group that it goes after these worship times for Celebrate Recovery, which allows you to say things like they have a much better introduction to the groups. They say, okay, I'm a child of God in recovery from this, rather than, hi, I'm Joe, I'm an addict. It's like that's I think a much better, like much better way of talking about ourselves than the I'm an addict type of language that's used in AA. So I think the thing, and also I think one of the big problems with AA is the disease model of addiction. I don't think we should think about addiction like a disease in the way that they're talking about it. And so I think the thing is, there's some things that are problematic philosophically. I don't think you could think about addiction like a disease in that way. I think there's better ways to get to a sense of like this, a sense of relief from it, from the guilt. It's better to look at something that, like, it's something that's become like autopilot. You're in bondage to it. It's not that you have a disease, because that's just weird. It's like I don't think that that's an accurate. I don't think that's a very healthy, good, or helpful way of talking about it. Um, so I think it can be confusing. I think it's an unnecessary construct. So, there are some different things that you might say that are part of this. Also, things like teachings like, okay, if you stay away from the meetings, you're definitely going to relapse. Well, there's a way in which that could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, but there also is a way in which you should keep attending meetings so that you'll gain insight and not relapse. So the thing is, you don't want to like have this. It's like, okay, I always have this problem. I'm an addict. I'm always going to be tempted. There's ways in which these things can be smart, but ways in which these things can take on lives of their own. So there are some different sides to the issue of the 12 steps, and there's different ways of looking at it. So there's a lot more that we could say about these approaches, I'm sure, but I think I want to leave this video here at this point, and to just simply say that, the 12 steps are there. We can use them this way. I'm sorry. And the thing is also that we can use and look at elements of Christian counseling as well. So whereas the 12 steps, I think, inhabit the area relative to Catholicism, we'd say they inhabit the same level as maybe modern Judaism or Islam. We then can also say that above the 12 steps would be Christian approaches, or Protestant approaches that are not necessarily Catholic. And these things would, of course, be redeemable as well, and much more so. So, and all of them would be so different from each other that I can't really make a statement on like what can be redeemable. I mean, some good things. Some people don't like things like theophostic prayer counseling. I actually kind of like the ideas of that. I mean, as long as you don't really think you're getting revelations, as long as you just realize you're just doing so. As long as you realize it's just a visualization technique. Basically, what it is you imagine that Jesus comes into a memory and says something to you. As long as you don't think that you're actually just on demand getting revelations and you're just trying to think, okay, what would he say, so that you can get emotional peace, I don't really see anything really that wrong with that. And there's also some resources from Dawn Eden Goldstein. She has a biography of Father Ed Dowling, so related to AA, and she also has some materials about healing our memories through visualizations like theophostic prayer counseling, but from a Catholic perspective. So she has some interesting works that could be helpful in both of these things that I'm talking about here, whether it's the 12-step materials or it's the Christian counseling type materials. So yeah, there's a lot of different things that you can redeem from these approaches, and I hope that this is helpful in understanding these ways of how we can bring these things into therapy. So hopefully this helps.